I found the original 50-50 partnership agreement pasted inside a crumbling 1,890 floral damask wallpaper sample book that my daughter-in-law had tossed out with the trash. That single scrap of paper not only voided her $630,000 sale of my life's work, it put her in an apron that says stripped of trust-matching remnants in a studio where every rental invoice prints her fraud docket number. This is the story of how a widow's quiet patience and a dead man's foresight turned a $3,200 brush-off into full, fragrant justice. My name is Margaret, and for 30 years I was a paper hanger. Not the kind who shows up with a wet roller and some pre-pasted vinyl from a big box store. I was the kind who arrived at dawn in a paint-splattered Ecanoline van with 3 pasting tables, a 5-gallon bucket of raw wheat flour, and a recipe for adhesive that my own grandmother learned from a Scottish master in 1911. I could mix paste to 4 different viscosities depending on the paper weight, the humidity, and the porosity of the plaster beneath. I knew how to soak a length of hand-printed Zuber mural until it relaxed into perfect pliability, how to book it in loose folds so the adhesive activated without drying, and how to lay it onto a wall so that not a single air bubble survived the sweep of my smoothing brush. I could cut around a complex electrical outlet box with a single pass of a breakaway knife, leaving a gap no wider than a thumbnail, and I could repair a torn 18th century domino paper so invisibly that a museum curator once wept when I showed her the patch under black light. My husband Henry was the quiet architect who studied every seam I cut and told me my corners were sharper than any speck he had ever drawn. He was the only person who ever understood that wallpaper wasn't decoration to me. It was patience made tactile. He passed from a sudden aneurysm 3 years back, leaving me his small pension, our fully paid-off bungalow on a maple-lined street, and a cash inheritance of $97,000. I could have tucked it into CDs and waited out my widowhood in careful silence. Instead, I poured every last cent into restoring a collection of 342 antique wallpaper sample books that a defunct textile mill in Pawtucket, Rhode Island, had been storing in a limestone basement since 1912. Henry would have understood. He always said that paper, when properly mounted, outlasts stone. My son Bradley married a woman named Claire 6 years ago. Claire carried a leather portfolio embossed with her initials in gold foil and had a way of tilting her head that made you feel like you were the only person in the room until you realized she was calculating your net worth. She worked in commercial real estate and spoke in a language of cap rates and pro forma adjustments that I never bothered to learn. When she heard about my sample books, she appeared at my kitchen table with an oat milk latte and a business plan printed on heavy linen cardstock. She proposed a 50-50 partnership. I would do what I already did, restore and curate the archive, catalog every swatch with its era, manufacturer, ground material, printing method, and pattern repeat. She would handle marketing, client acquisition, website logistics, and all the legal paperwork. Within 6 months, we opened a rental studio called Period Wall in a converted textile loft on the east side. 2,000 square feet with original maple floors and floor-to-ceiling steel shelving, where set designers for period films could pull authentic, era-specific patterns for their shoots. I notarized the partnership agreement at a small UPS store on a Wednesday morning, a 6-page document that spelled out shared ownership, equal profit splits, and a clause I barely glanced at that said no dissolution could proceed without both partners physically present before a jointly designated notary. Claire hugged me so tight my ribs protested for 3 days. I remember thinking her perfume smelled like crushed gardenias and ambition. The collection was a living museum of paste and pigment. We had a 1,786 French domino paper sample bound in hand-marbled boards, its ground tinted with lapis lazuli. We had a full run of William Morris's first commercial patterns from 1864, the Pimpernel and the Daisy, and the Trellis, each still bearing the faint impressions of the pearwood blocks that printed them. We had a set of 1,897 San Francisco arts and crafts friezes that smelled faintly of linseed oil and the sea salt that had leached into the storage trunk. There was a 1,820s flocked panel in crimson and gold that had been salvaged from a Boston townhouse before it was demolished for a parking garage, and 3 complete sample books from a Manchester mill that had supplied wall coverings for Queen Victoria's private railway carriage. I logged every swatch into a database that Claire promised to manage, but never did. I used a spectrophotometer to match faded colors. Digitally so-set decorators could request any pattern recreated on modern ground stock while preserving the original antique. I spent my evenings mixing conservation-grade wheat paste from a recipe that called for distilled water, a pinch of copper sulfate to inhibit mold, and a small dollop of glycerin to keep the adhesive flexible over decades. For 2 years, the studio hummed. A costumer from HBO rented 3 rolls of an 1830s flocked stripe for a Gothic horror miniseries. A production designer for a merchant ivory period piece pulled a full suite of Chinese hand-painted panels from 1840, each one depicting a different season in faded indigo and terracotta. The rental fees trickled in at $600 a day, sometimes $1,200, when the production was desperate for a specific undocumented pattern, and I poured every penny back into restoring more books, dreaming of the day I could finally paper my own bedroom in a Victorian rose trellis I had found folded inside an 1888 sample from that Manchester mill, a design so deeply registered that the thorns seemed to cast shadows under oblique light. Then a production company called Epoch Lens Studios made an offer. They were reconstructing a turn-of-the-century textile baron's mansion entirely on a soundstage in Atlanta, and they wanted to acquire the entire archive outright so their art director could scan every sample at high resolution and selectively reproduce them for permanent set installation. Their offer was $630,000, wired into escrow within 10 days of signing. Claire forwarded me the email with a subject line that read, "We're rich, Mama M." I sat in my workshop with a half-restored flocked panel under a weighted glass plate, and I felt my stomach drop. Selling the collection would mean losing the rental income that sustained the studio, closing a resource that had become beloved by a small but fiercely loyal community of film archivists, and most painfully, parting with objects I had handled with the same tenderness I once used on Henry's hands when his arthritis flared. I told Claire I needed time to think. She said she would negotiate a royalty clause that paid me a lifetime licensing fee per film, something that would keep me solvent without the overhead of the studio lease. She said, "Trust me, I'm the negotiator in this family." I believed her. I was a paper hanger, not a businesswoman. I believed her. 2 weeks later, Claire handed me a check for $3,200 and called it a pattern royalty. She stood in my foyer wearing a dove-gray silk blouse and a smile so symmetrical it could have been drawn with a ruling pen. She explained that she had dissolved our partnership based on a mutual dissolution clause she had discovered in the original agreement, sold the entire collection to Epoch Lens for the full $630,000, and that this check represented my fair share of the post-sale residuals after expenses. She placed a notarized dissolution form on the hall table, signed by me, bearing a signature that looped in a way that looked enough like my own to fool a DMV clerk. I stared at it. The M in Margaret swooped too low, the T crossed at the wrong angle, but I was too stunned to speak. My hands shook so violently that the check fluttered to the floor. Claire picked it up, pressed it into my palm with her cool fingers, and said, "Don't worry, I already moved the archive last night. The truck left at 2 a.m. This is done." She patted my arm and walked to her car, and I heard the engine turn over while I was still standing in the doorway, holding a piece of paper worth less than the paste that had once held a hand-printed frieze to a wall I would never see again. I called Bradley. He arrived 10 minutes later wearing a pressed polo shirt and his open house smile, the one he used to sell starter homes to young couples who didn't notice the water stains in the basement. He told me that Claire had handled everything by the book and that I should be grateful she had secured any payout at all. He said they were going to list our bungalow for sale as a favor to me because I was getting on in years and shouldn't be rattling around alone in a house with 3 unused bedrooms. He said, "Mom, you need to simplify. The market's hot. You can move into the guest suite for a while and we'll take care of everything." The vultures had not just circled. They had landed, folded their wings, and started pecking at the foundation of my life. They just didn't know I had been a paper hanger long enough to recognize when a seam didn't match. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table staring at the check. The silence was absolute except for the tick of Henry's old wind-up clock on the mantel. Then I remembered something. Claire had been in the attic the day before, supposedly clearing out junk to make the house more market-ready. She had dragged a cardboard carton to the curb, the one where Henry kept his personal collection of antique wallpaper sample books he had picked up at estate sales and flea markets over 30 years. I had completely forgotten about it. The trash truck hadn't come yet. I walked outside in the October dark, wearing Henry's old barn coat over my cardigan, and I found the box overturned near the recycling bin, its contents spilling onto the damp asphalt. Rain had started to fall, a fine drizzle that beaded on the spines of the old books. I knelt and lifted them one by one. A 1780s block-printed vine pattern in faded ochre, a slim folio of French marbled end papers. And then my fingers closed around a book I recognized immediately, an 1890s floral damask sample book, its cover edged in gold tooling that had dulled to a soft brass sheen, the spine cracked, but the binding still sound. I had last seen it on Henry's nightstand the week before he died. He had told me he found it at a flea market in Bristol and thought the damask pattern would look beautiful in my workshop someday. I carried it inside and set it on a clean cotton towel on the kitchen table. I opened the front cover with the care of someone removing a pressure bandage from a burn victim. The inside paste down was thick and layered, made of a heavy rag paper that had been glued and pressed over the board with an adhesive that still smelled faintly of animal hide glue and clove oil, a preservative old bookbinders used to deter silverfish. Surface felt uneven, and when I ran my thumb along the edge of the paste-down, I realized there was a hand-cut pocket of marbled paper, a secret compartment formed by lifting the top layer and re-gluing its edges. Henry had made hidden pockets in his architectural sketchbooks to hold his favorite mechanical pencils. I knew his work. I slid a bone folder into the slit and gently teased the pocket open. Inside, I felt a folded sheaf of legal-sized pages, crisp and dry. I pulled them out and unfolded them on the towel. It was our original 50-50 partnership agreement, the 6-page document I had notarized at that UPS store 3 years earlier. My signature was sharp and correct, the M standing tall, the T crossed at exactly the right height. Claire's signature looped beside it, exactly as she practiced. The notary seal was raised and intact, with the county clerk's embossed stamp and a file number. Section 14, subparagraph C, stated that no dissolution, sale, or transfer of any asset within the collection could proceed without the physical presence and written consent of both partners at a jointly designated notary, and that any attempt to conduct such a transaction unilaterally would render the sale utterly void ab initio, a Latin phrase I had to look up later, but that in the moment felt like a bell ringing far underground. The document was witnessed and stamped. Claire had either never read that clause or assumed she could bypass it, because she had forged my signature on a fake dissolution form and claimed the original was lost. But it wasn't lost. It was right here, concealed in a sample book Henry had bought for the pattern and repurposed as a little safe. But the part that made my throat close wasn't the legal clause. Inside the back cover, on the final flyleaf in Henry's neat architectural hand, written in the sepia ink he used in his fountain pen, I found a short note pressed into the fibers as if he had written it in a hurry but with absolute clarity. It read, "If you're reading this, Claire has shown her hand. Do not trust them. Save yourself." Henry had bought this sample book 6 months before he died. He must have slipped our signed agreement into the pocket and written that warning when he first sensed something off about Claire. He never said a word to me directly. He was a quiet architect, but he always spotted a flaw in the framing before the walls went up. Before I continue this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe a paper trail will always outlast a liar's smile. I didn't call a lawyer the next morning. I didn't call anyone. I took the original partnership agreement, placed it inside a fireproof document sleeve, and slid that sleeve into the false bottom of an old pasting board I kept in my workshop, beneath a layer of dented, glue-crusted oak plywood that no one would ever think to search. Then I brewed a pot of strong tea, and I did what any woman who spent decades matching patterns does. I studied the seams of Claire's scheme and planned my strike. Less than 48 hours after handing me the pattern check, Claire and Bradley arrived with a settlement agreement. They wanted me to sign a release waiving all claims to the collection, the sale proceeds, and the partnership in exchange for a one-time additional payment of $4,000 on top of the original check. The document was 12 pages long, filled with dense legal phrasing about mutual indemnification and voluntary dissolution, and it contained a clause buried on page 9 that assigned all future residual rights to Claire personally. Claire sat beside me at my own kitchen table, wearing a high-collared blouse and clicking a silver pen. She said, "This is just a formality to tie a neat bow on everything. You'll be fully protected, Mama M. We don't want any loose ends." Bradley hovered by the refrigerator, sketching a listing price for the bungalow on the back of a grocery receipt. I let my hands tremble visibly. I let my voice go soft and reedy, the voice of a bewildered old woman who couldn't quite follow the conversation. I said, "This is all so confusing. My head feels foggy, dear. Can I just rest for a few days?" Claire's eyes flickered with something like triumph. She patted my wrist and said my recent stress was understandable, and then she offered to let me stay in their guest suite for a week or two, just to take care of me while I recovered. I recognized the tactic immediately. They wanted me under their roof where they could monitor me, control my access to the phone, and eventually wear me down until I signed whatever they placed in front of me. I said yes. I was counting on it. I moved into their 4-bedroom colonial on a cul-de-sac with a 3-car garage and a formal dining room that smelled of potpourri and deception on Saturday morning. I brought one small suitcase of clothes and my pasting board, which I told them was a craft project to keep my hands busy. The guest room was down a short hall from Bradley's home office, a room he kept locked whenever he stepped out, even to fetch the mail. I unpacked my cardigans into the dresser and began my quiet observation. The first concrete red flag arrived on Monday morning. I was sitting in the breakfast nook with a cup of weak coffee when Claire's mobile phone rang on the granite counter. She answered and walked toward the pantry, but the acoustics in that house bounced her voice straight down the hallway. I heard her say, "The wire transfer needs to land in the personal checking, not the business account. No, I don't care about the tax implications, I just need it liquid. Call the branch manager again and tell him to override the routing number." She was diverting the sale proceeds directly into her own personal banking, bypassing any partnership escrow. Later that same afternoon, I was folding laundry in the mudroom when Bradley's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, went pale, and walked out to the garage to take the call. Through the door, I heard fragments. "Mr. Coleman, I can explain. The loan payment is coming in 10 days. I just need a little more patience." Coleman Collection Agency, they were drowning in debt. The $630,000 from Epoch Lens wasn't a windfall to them. It was a bailout, and I was the co-signer they had forged to secure the original personal loan. I began to make myself methodically useful around the house. On Tuesday, I noticed that a 12-inch strip of silk moire wallpaper in their formal dining room was peeling away from the baseboard, the edge curling inward like a dried leaf. The paper was a pale celadon green, a reproduction of an 1830s French pattern, but whoever had hung it had used a poor-quality premixed adhesive that was now crystallizing and losing its bond. I found a tub of raw wheat starch in the mudroom, left over from a craft project, mixed a fresh batch of paste with cold water and a pinch of salt until it reached the consistency of heavy cream, and I brought it to the dining room. I cleaned the wall with a damp sponge, applied a thin, even layer of paste with a smoothing brush, and worked the strip back into place with a bone folder, applying steady pressure from the center outward until the seam vanished completely. Claire walked in mid-stroke and stopped dead. She said, "I didn't know you could still do that." I looked up, my hand still steady, and said, "Old habits. The adhesive just needs to be matched to the ground paper." She nodded slowly and walked away, but I could feel the shift in her assessment of me. I was a relic, yes, a widow who mixed her own paste, but relics can be underestimated if you never see the steel underneath the starch. That night, after they had both gone to bed, I retrieved a black trash bag from the side bin outside Bradley's locked office. The bag was heavy and rattled with the sound of paper shreds. I carried it to the guest room, locked the door, spread a clean bedsheet on the floor, and poured out the contents. Hundreds of narrow strips of paper, some cross-cut, some merely ribboned, the remains of what I guessed was a single large document. I knelt on the floor and began to reassemble the strips, edge to edge, using small pieces of pH-neutral tape to hold them together. It took 2 hours. I worked in silence, My old eyes straining but my brain wired with the same methodical patience I used to match a 24-inch pattern repeat across a 17-foot wall. Piece by piece, the document emerged. It was the forged dissolution of partnership form that Claire had presented to me in the foyer, the original copy she had shredded after notarizing it with a mobile notary 300 miles away. My forged signature was on the third page, dated 2 weeks before the sale. The notary stamp bore a number registered in a county I had never visited. I photographed every reassembled page with my phone, front and back, then carefully rebagged the shreds and returned the bag to the bin exactly as I found it. Next, I needed access to Bradley's office itself. The door had a standard Schlage key and knob lock, a 5-pin tumbler mechanism common in residential construction. Henry had taught me basic lockpicking 20 years ago, not for any illicit purpose, but because he was a tinkerer who believed every woman should know how to open a door when the key was lost and the hardware store was closed. I kept a small tension wrench and a half-diamond pick inside a hollowed-out copy of the paper Hanger's Companion that I always carried in my kit. I waited until Thursday morning, when both of them left for a country club brunch with clients. I knelt at the lock, slid the tension wrench into the keyway, applied light rotational pressure with my left thumb, and carefully raked the pins with the pick. I could feel each pin stack through the tension wrench, a subtle resistance that spoke to my fingers in the same language as a reluctant air bubble under a pasted drop. The third pin set with a faint metallic click, then the fourth, then the fifth. The plug rotated, and the door swung open. I was inside in under 40 seconds. The office smelled of dry erase markers and stale coffee. Bradley's desk was a massive cherrywood expanse with a rolling chair. Beside it stood a 2-drawer metal filing cabinet with a built-in lock. I picked the wafer lock in 15 seconds and opened the top drawer. Inside, organized in hanging folders, I found the original unredacted sale contract with Epoch Lens Studios, signed only by Claire on behalf of the partnership, with a line item that the archive was being sold free and clear of all claims. There was also a promissory note, dated 3 months earlier, for a personal loan of $220,000 extended to Bradley and Claire Calloway by a private lender called Meridian Capital. The note listed the entire Wallpaper collection as collateral and, in a separate attachment, named me, Margaret Fallon, as a personal guarantor. My signature was forged again, this time in a slightly different style as if Claire had gotten better at copying it. I was on the hook for their entire debt. Below that was a bank statement showing the loan payoff from the Epoch Lens wire and the remaining balance, over $400,000, transferred into Claire's personal checking account at a national bank ending in 8842. I photographed every document, using my phone's flash, and then I noticed a USB drive in the pen tray. I plugged it into my small tablet, which I had brought in my waistband, and copied the entire contents of their digital tax folder, which included scanned versions of the forged guarantee and emails between Claire and the lender discussing how to structure the loan so the sale would cover it exactly. I closed everything, relocked the drawers, wiped my prints with a microfiber cloth, and relocked the office door. I returned to the guest room, sat on the edge of the bed, and felt my heart beating slow and steady. The calm was the same calm I felt when I found the true plumb line on a crooked 19th century wall. Everything was out of true, but I now had the measurements to correct it. Henry's hidden partnership agreement contained a mechanism that neither of them had anticipated. Because the original document was notarized and filed with the county clerk as a registered partnership, the sale of any asset requiring transfer of title had to be executed in person by both partners before a jointly appointed notary. Claire's forged dissolution form, presented to Epoch Lens, was legally void because it claimed the original was lost when it never was. The sale contract was therefore fraudulent, and the transaction could be unwound if I moved before the collection shipped overseas. I called the compliance officer at the bank that had processed the wire transfer, a woman named Diane Okonkwo, who specialized in elder financial exploitation investigations. I told her I had documentary evidence of forgery, fraudulent sale of partnership assets, and a forged personal guarantee naming me as a co-signer on a loan I had never seen. Her voice was low and steady. She gave me a case number and asked me to bring in every piece of evidence the next morning. I did. I presented the original partnership agreement, the photographs of the shredded dissolution, the promissory note with the forged guarantee, and the bank statement showing the misappropriated funds. Diane placed an immediate freeze on the remaining balance in Claire's account, pending a full fraud review, and she flagged the Epoch Lens transaction for suspension. I also contacted a lawyer named Mrs. Evelyn Tuong, a woman I had met years before when she sued a French mill for mass reproducing her client's hand-blocked 18th century pattern without consent. Evelyn was now in her late 60s, wore silk scarves, and had a laugh like a crow, and she specialized in intellectual property and partnership dissolution. I emailed her the documents from a library computer. Within 3 hours, she filed an emergency petition in civil court to void the sale and reclaim the collection. But I needed one more thing before the trap fully closed. I needed to know if there was any shred of genuine humanity left in the woman who had once hugged me and called me Mama M. So I staged a test. On Saturday, a day when I knew both Claire and Bradley would be home for lunch, I waited until Claire was at the kitchen island sorting paperwork and Bradley was scrolling his phone in the living room. I stood by the sink, letting a glass slip from my fingers into the basin with a sharp crack, and then I clutched my chest with both hands, gasped loudly, and dropped to the tile floor like a felled tree. The thud was real. I felt the impact in my hip and shoulder, but I stayed limp, breathing shallowly, my eyes half open and glazed. Claire turned at the noise, saw me on the floor, and stepped over my legs to reach a manila folder on the counter. She said, "Brad, get the signature page from the car before the ink dries on the forms." She didn't look down. Bradley sauntered into the kitchen, glanced at me, and said, "Mom, stop being dramatic. We don't have time for this." He walked out to the garage. A full 45 seconds passed. I counted them in my head while my pulse hammered against my ribs. Then Claire, sighing, picked up her phone and called 911. She told the dispatcher I was just faint, probably dehydrated. No need for sirens. The ambulance arrived, and I let them take me to the hospital for a full workup that showed nothing wrong. I came home that evening to a house full of silence and a fresh stack of legal documents on the guest bed. I burned every internal bridge that night, staring at the ceiling until the room went gray with dawn. The confrontation arrived 4 days later. A senior bank investigator named Marcus Wells had notified Claire that the funds in her personal account were frozen pending verification of the original partnership document. Claire, panicked and still unaware that I was the source of the freeze, told me that we needed to visit the bank together to sign a simple release form to unlock the money. She thought she just needed the confused old widow to scribble her name in front of a teller, and everything would slide back into place. She helped me into a lavender cardigan, poured me a cup of chamomile tea, and drove me to the first mercantile branch on Belford Avenue in a Lexus that smelled of leather conditioner and moral decay. Bradley waited in the car, parked near the dumpsters, because Claire said having him inside might make me anxious. She walked me through the lobby with her hand tight around my elbow, her lacquered nails dimpling my skin through the cardigan. We sat in a small cubicle with a bank officer named Patricia, a calm woman in a navy blazer. Claire pulled out a fresh set of documents, a reinstatement of partnership and mutual indemnity agreement that would authorize the release of all escrowed funds to her individually and permanently extinguish my ownership rights. Patricia placed the papers in front of me and asked if I understood their purpose. Claire began to answer for me in a silky voice. I held up my hand. My voice came out strong and clear, without a tremor. I said, "I understand that my daughter-in-law forged my signature on a dissolution form, sold my life's work, named me as a personal guarantor on her private debts, and is now trying to force me to sign away the last proof of my ownership. I will not be signing anything today." Claire's face froze, and then she hissed, in a voice like a snapped harp string, "You senile old woman, you have no idea what you've just done." I reached into my deep cardigan pocket and pulled out a photocopy of the original partnership agreement, the one Henry had hidden in the floral damask sample book. I slid it across the desk on top of her reinstatement papers. I said, "I have exactly the right idea. And starting today, every invoice from my new studio will print your fraud docket number, case number 24CF 3981. Patricia pressed a small button under the edge of her desk. Within 30 seconds, 2 federal investigators from the Elder Fraud Task Force, who had been waiting in the branch manager's office, stepped into the cubicle and read Claire her rights. She was arrested on the spot for forgery, financial exploitation of an elder, and felony theft by fraud. Bradley was detained in the parking lot as a conspirator, still sitting in the Lexus with the engine running. The collection was physically recovered from a shipping container at a port warehouse in Newark, still wrapped in acid-free tissue, every sample book accounted for and untouched. The aftermath was a slow, detailed unspooling that I watched like a freshly pasted mural drying flat and true. Claire and Bradley both accepted plea deals rather than face a jury. Claire received 4 years in state prison and was ordered to pay restitution of $72,000, the precise amount she had skimmed beyond the loan payoff and hidden in a secondary account. Bradley got 2 years of probation and 200 hours of community service for his role in the fraud, which mostly involved falsifying property documents and conspiring to defraud. Their colonial house and both vehicles were seized under civil forfeiture to satisfy the fraudulent personal guarantee I had never actually owed. Epoch Lens Studios, whose legal team had reviewed the voided contract, responded with surprising grace. Rather than walk away or sue, they signed a new exclusive rental agreement with me for $20,000 a month to access the archive for their soundstage production, because the publicity of standing with a defrauded widow generated excellent press for their upcoming film. I received the full collection back in the same loft, but I repainted the walls a clean gallery white and installed a steel security door with a biometric lock. I registered a new trade name with the state. Paper Over Lies Wallpaper opened on a cold Tuesday morning with a small ceremony attended by 3 set decorators, 2 museum curators, and Mrs. Evelyn Truong, who brought champagne. I configured the rental software so that every invoice, every receipt, and every contract automatically prints a header that reads, "Per court order, this transaction is conducted under the permanent authority of Case No. 24 CF 3981, Section 4, Subparagraph B. There's a line at the bottom that says, "This document is issued as a valid record under penalty of the original dissemination of false instruments." It's a small, precise bit of poetic justice that makes me smile every time the printer hums. And Claire. After her release, she arrived at my doorstep accompanied by a probation officer who carried a work release order signed by a judge. The restitution terms included 500 hours of unpaid labor at the victim's place of business. I could have refused, but I didn't. I opened the door, looked at her diminished figure in a state-issued cotton blouse, and handed her an apron I had stitched myself in the evenings while she sat in her cell. It's white canvas with black block letters that I hand-screen printed using a simple pigment-hand binder mixture that will never fade. It says stripped of trust. She wears it every shift, 3 afternoons a week, while she sits at a long table in the back sorting remnant wallpaper pieces into labeled pattern sample packets for interior designers who can't afford full rolls. She doesn't speak to me, and I don't need her to. The sound of her scissors cutting along a straight edge, the small sigh of paper separating along a grain line, is apology enough. Sometimes, when the light slants through the skylight, I see her glance at the framed note on my counter, the one Henry wrote in his sepia ink, and I know she's reading it again. Henry's original note, the short warning he left inside that 1890s floral damask sample book, is mounted behind the counter in a shadow box, next to a photograph of the book itself and a small cutting of the damask pattern he thought would look beautiful in my workshop. Every morning I walk past it and remember that paper, when properly mounted, outlasts stone. It outlasts greed. It outlasts the brittle promises of people who smile too long. Integrity is the only adhesive that holds a life together, and I still mix mine fresh every time. Have you ever discovered a dark secret about someone you trusted completely? How did you handle it? If you believe that a paper trail will always outlast a liar's smile, hit subscribe and join me next time. I'm Margaret, and this is Paper Over Lies.